Grandma, am I allowed to eat today? Helen Marston's hand froze midair, the ladle hovering over a simple bowl of chicken noodle soup. The question hung in the kitchen like smoke after a fire, visible, suffocating, impossible to ignore. Her 7-year-old granddaughter stood by the table, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the steaming bowl as if it were something forbidden, something she might not deserve. Helen had spent 40 years teaching second graders. She knew the difference between a child who was shy and a child who was afraid. This was fear, deep, learned, conditioned fear. The morning had started with chaos. Her phone had rung just after 6, jolting her from sleep. It was Daniel, her son-in-law, his voice tight and hurried. "Helen, I need a favor. Can you take Emily for a few days? Something came up at work." No explanation, no details, just urgency. When his car pulled up 2 hours later, Helen watched from the window. Daniel barely turned off the engine before opening the back door. Emily climbed out slowly, clutching a small backpack. No suitcase, no jacket, even though the October air was sharp with cold. Daniel walked her to the porch, said something Helen couldn't hear, then turned and left. He didn't hug her, didn't wait to see if she got inside safely, just drove away. Helen opened the door. Emily stood there, small and still, her dark hair tangled, her jeans too loose around her waist. "Hi, sweetheart," Helen said gently. "Come in." Emily stepped inside without a word. Her eyes darted around the living room as if cataloging exits. Helen felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Now, in the kitchen, that chill deepened into something colder. "Of course you can eat, honey," Helen said, forcing her voice to stay calm. She set the bowl on the table. "You can eat whenever you're hungry." Emily stared at the soup. Her hands trembled slightly as she picked up the spoon. She took one bite, then another. Then she started eating fast, almost desperately, as if someone might take it away. The soup dribbled down her chin. She didn't stop to wipe
Grandma.
it. She just kept eating, her breathing quick and shallow. Helen sat down across from her, her chest tight. This wasn't normal hunger. This was survival. When the bowl was empty, Emily set the spoon down carefully and looked up. Her eyes were glassy, uncertain. "Was that okay?" she whispered. Helen reached across the table and touched her hand. "Yes, baby. That was perfectly okay." But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this was okay. After lunch, Helen suggested they do some coloring. She pulled out old crayons and a stack of paper she kept for moments like this. Emily sat at the table, quiet and careful, choosing colors slowly. She drew a house, a tree, a sun in the corner, all of it neat and small, confined to one section of the page as if she were afraid to take up too much space. Helen watched her. The child's movements were controlled, deliberate. No wild scribbles, no joy, just precision. "That's beautiful," Helen said softly. Emily didn't respond. She kept coloring, her face blank. Helen's mind churned. Something was wrong. Deeply, seriously wrong. But she didn't know what yet. And she couldn't accuse Daniel without proof. He was fragile since losing his wife. Fragile and defensive. If Helen went in too hard, too fast, she'd lose access to Emily entirely. So she'd have to be smart, methodical, the way she used to be. That evening, Helen ran a bath for Emily. The child stood in the bathroom doorway, staring at the tub as if it were unfamiliar. "Do you need help getting in?" Helen asked gently. Emily shook her head, but didn't move. Helen stepped closer. "Can I help you with your shirt?" Emily flinched. It was small, barely noticeable, but Helen saw it. She always saw it. "It's okay," Helen murmured. "I just want to make sure you're comfortable." Slowly, Emily lifted her arms. Helen pulled the shirt over her head and her breath caught. Bruises, faded but unmistakable. Finger-shaped marks on Emily's upper arms. Yellowing now, which meant they were at least a week old, maybe more. Helen's vision narrowed. Her pulse pounded in her ears. "Sweetheart," she said, keeping her voice steady. "How did you get these?" Emily looked down at her arms as if seeing them for the first time. "I fall a lot." "You fall?" "Yeah, I'm clumsy." The answer came too fast, too practiced. Helen knelt down so they were eye level. Emily, listen to me. If someone is hurting you, you can tell me. I promise you won't get in trouble. Emily's face went pale. She shook her head quickly. No one's hurting me. I just fall. Helen didn't push. Not yet. Pushing a scared child never worked. Instead, she helped Emily into the bath, washed her hair gently, and wrapped her in a towel afterward. She found an old nightgown that had belonged to Emily's mother and helped her into it. When Emily was in bed, Helen sat beside her. The child's eyes were wide, staring at the ceiling. Grandma? Yes, honey. How long do I have to stay here? Helen smoothed the hair back from Emily's forehead. As long as you need to. Emily didn't respond. She just closed her eyes. Helen waited until the child's breathing slowed, then quietly left the room. She went to the kitchen, pulled out an old notebook from the drawer, and sat down at the table. She wrote the date at the top of the page. Then she began listing everything she'd observed. Bruises on upper arms, finger-shaped, approximately 1 week old, extreme caution around food, asked permission to eat, flinching, fearful body language, no belongings, no explanation from father. This notebook had once held lesson plans. Now it looked like something else entirely, something she'd hoped never to see again. Helen had worked with Child Protective Services years ago, back when she was still teaching. She'd been trained to spot the signs, trained to document, trained to act. She'd retired from that world deliberately. It was exhausting, heartbreaking, the kind of work that stayed with you long after you left the classroom. But Emily needed someone who wasn't afraid to look closely, someone who knew what questions to ask and how to ask them. And Helen had never been afraid of the truth. She closed the notebook and stared out the window into the darkness. Somewhere out there, Daniel was going about his life. Maybe he knew what was happening. Maybe he didn't. Either way, Helen would find out. Because bruises didn't lie, and neither did a child who was too afraid to eat. The crackers were hidden inside the pillowcase. Helen discovered them the next morning while changing the sheets. 3 saltines, wrapped carefully in a napkin, tucked deep into the fabric where no one would find them. The napkin was damp from being clutched too tightly. 1 cracker had crumbled into pieces. Helen stood there holding the pillowcase, staring at the small cache of food as if it were evidence at a crime scene. Which, in a way, it was. Children hoarded food for one reason. They'd been starved, systematically, repeatedly, until their bodies learned that hunger wasn't temporary. It was a constant threat that required preparation. Helen's hands shook. She set the pillowcase down carefully, left the crackers where they were, and walked out of the room. In the kitchen, she opened her notebook and wrote, Day 2. Found food hidden in pillowcase. 3 saltine crackers. Child is hoarding in case of deprivation. She underlined the last sentence twice. Emily appeared in the doorway, her hair messy from sleep. She was wearing the same nightgown from the night before, but she'd pulled it tight around herself as if trying to disappear inside it. Good morning, sweetheart, Helen said, closing the notebook quickly. Are you hungry? Emily nodded, but her eyes darted to the notebook, then away. Helen made scrambled eggs and toast. She put the plate in front of Emily and watched. The child ate slowly this time, more controlled than yesterday, but her eyes kept flicking toward Helen as if checking for approval, checking to see if the food would be taken away. When she finished, Emily folded her napkin neatly and placed it beside her plate. Then she sat very still, hands in her lap, waiting. You can get down if you're done, Helen said gently. Emily slid off the chair and walked to the living room. She sat on the couch, hands folded, back straight, like a child waiting for instructions, waiting to be told what to do next. Helen followed her. Would you like to watch TV? Emily looked confused. Am I allowed? The question hit Helen like a slap. Yes, honey. You're allowed. She turned on the television, found a cartoon, and handed Emily the remote. The child held it as if it were fragile, precious, something she wasn't used to having. Helen went back to the kitchen and opened the notebook again. She wrote for 20 minutes, documenting everything. The way Emily asked permission for basic things, the way she sat too still, the way she never made noise, never complained, never asked for anything. This was a child who'd been trained, conditioned, broken into silence. Helen had seen it before, years ago in her classroom. A student named Marcus who never spoke above a whisper, who apologized constantly, who flinched when anyone moved too quickly near him. It had taken 3 months of careful observation before Helen had enough evidence to involve authorities. 3 months of watching a child suffer while she built a case strong enough to protect him. She'd promised herself she'd never go through that again. The weight of it. The nights lying awake, wondering if she was doing enough. The fear that she'd missed something critical. But here she was. Again. That afternoon, Helen suggested they take a walk. The weather was cool but clear, and she thought fresh air might help. Emily put on her thin jacket, too small, Helen noticed, the sleeves ending above her wrists, and followed Helen outside. They walked down the quiet street, past neighbors' houses with neat lawns and autumn decorations. Emily stayed close, her steps small and careful. She didn't run ahead, didn't point at things, didn't ask questions. "Do you like school?" Helen asked. Emily shrugged. "It's okay." "What's your favorite subject?" Another shrug. "I don't know." Helen tried again. "Do you have friends?" Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then, so softly Helen almost missed it. "Not really." They walked in silence. Helen's mind raced. Isolated child. No social connections. Classic pattern of abuse. Keep the victim separated. Keep them dependent. Keep them quiet. When they returned home, Helen made hot chocolate. Emily drank it slowly, cupping the mug in both hands as if savoring the warmth. When she finished, she looked up at Helen. "Thank you," she whispered. "You're welcome, sweetheart." Emily hesitated. "Grandma?" "Yes?" "Are you going to tell Daddy I've been good?" Helen's chest tightened. "You don't have to be good for me to keep you here, Emily. You're my granddaughter. You belong here." Emily looked down at her hands. "Okay." But the tension in her shoulders didn't ease. That night, Helen waited until Emily was asleep, then went through the child's backpack. It contained almost nothing. One change of clothes, a toothbrush, a small stuffed rabbit that looked old and well-worn, no school supplies, no homework, no notes from teachers. At the bottom of the bag, Helen found something that made her stomach turn. A folded piece of paper. She opened it carefully. It was a list. Written in a child's handwriting, shaky but legible. Rules. Don't talk too much. Finish everything on your plate. Don't ask for more. Be quiet when Dad is busy. Don't talk about Sabrina. Helen read the list 3 times. Her hands were trembling so badly she had to set the paper down. Don't talk about Sabrina. There it was. A name. A name Daniel had never mentioned. A name that clearly carried weight, carried fear. Helen picked up her phone and called Daniel. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. "Daniel, it's Helen. Call me when you get this. We need to talk about Emily." She hung up and stared at the list again. This wasn't just neglect. This was control. Systematic, deliberate control. And this Sabrina, whoever she was at the center of it. Helen opened her notebook and added a new page. At the top, she wrote 1 word, Sabrina. Then she began listing questions. Who was she? How long had she been in Daniel's life? Did she live with them? What was her relationship to Emily? Helen knew Daniel's history. Knew he'd been alone since his wife died 3 years ago. Knew he'd struggled, but he'd never mentioned anyone new, never brought anyone to family gatherings, never said a word about moving on. So who was this woman? And why was Emily forbidden from talking about her? Helen closed the notebook and walked to Emily's room. She stood in the doorway, watching the child sleep. Emily's face was peaceful now, but even in sleep, her body was curled tight, defensive, protecting herself from threats that didn't exist here but clearly existed Somewhere. Helen thought about Marcus again, the student she'd saved all those years ago. It had taken everything she had, documentation, persistence, courage, but she'd done it. She'd gotten him out. She could do it again. She had to. Because Emily deserved more than rules written in a child's desperate handwriting, more than hidden crackers and permission to eat, more than fear disguised as obedience. Helen returned to the kitchen, sat down with her notebook, and began writing. She documented the list, the hoarded food, the bruises, the questions Emily asked, the way she moved through the world like someone constantly bracing for punishment. By the time Helen finished, it was nearly midnight. Her hand ached from writing, her eyes burned from exhaustion, but the evidence was there, clear, undeniable, and tomorrow she would dig deeper, because old habits, it turned out, didn't die, they just waited. Waited for the moment they were needed most, and Helen's instincts were awake now. Fully, fiercely awake. The crayon slipped from Emily's hand and rolled across the table. Helen was washing dishes when she heard it, the small clatter followed by silence. She turned to see Emily staring at the fallen crayon as if it had committed a crime. The child's face had gone pale, her breathing quick and shallow. "It's okay, honey," Helen said, drying her hands. "It just fell." But Emily didn't move. She sat frozen, eyes fixed on the purple crayon now resting near the edge of the table. Her hands were clenched in her lap, knuckles white. Helen walked over slowly, picked up the crayon and set it back on the table. Emily flinched when Helen's hand came near, then immediately tried to hide the reaction by looking down. "Emily," Helen said gently, sitting down beside her. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." The word came out too fast. Helen glanced at the coloring page. Emily had been drawing a family, a tall figure, a smaller figure, and off to the side, away from the others, a third figure with long hair and sharp lines for a mouth. "Who's this?" Helen pointed to the tall figure. "Daddy." "And this one?" "Me." Helen pointed to the figure with the angry mouth. "Who's this?" Emily's jaw tightened. She shook her head. "Sweetheart, you can tell me." "I'm not supposed to." Helen kept her voice soft, careful. "Not supposed to what?" Emily's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her lips together hard, fighting them back. Then, so quietly Helen almost missed it, she whispered, "Talk about Sabrina?" The name landed like a stone in still water. Helen felt the ripples spread through her chest, cold and sharp. "Who's Sabrina?" she asked, her tone deliberately calm. Emily's tears spilled over. "Daddy said if I talk about her, I'll get in trouble." Helen reached out and gently took Emily's hand. "You won't get in trouble with me. I promise." Emily looked up, searching Helen's face as if trying to determine whether that was true. Then, slowly, she spoke. "She lives with us." Helen's pulse quickened. "How long has she lived with you?" Emily shrugged. "I don't know. A long time." "Does she live in your house? Or does she visit?" "She lives there, in Mommy's old room." The words hit Helen like a punch. Daniel had never mentioned anyone, never said he was seeing someone, never brought anyone to family gatherings. And now this child was saying some woman had been living in his home, in his late wife's bedroom, for months? Years? Helen forced herself to stay calm. "What does Sabrina do?" Emily wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "She's there when I get home from school. She makes dinner. She tells Daddy what to do." "What do you mean, she tells Daddy what to do?" Emily hesitated. "Like, she says when we can eat and when I have to go to my room, and Daddy listens to her." Helen's stomach twisted. "Does Sabrina ever hurt you?" Emily went very still. The silence stretched long and heavy. "Emily, I'm not supposed to say." "Sweetheart, if someone is hurting you..." "She says if I tell Daddy we'll get in trouble. She says they'll take me away and I'll never see him again." There it was, the control, the manipulation, the threat designed to keep a 7-year-old silent. Helen took a slow breath, steadying herself. "Emily, listen to me very carefully. If someone is hurting you, telling the truth won't get your daddy in trouble. It will help keep you safe. Do you understand? Emily shook her head. She said you'd say that. She said everyone would lie to me. Helen felt rage building in her chest, hot and sharp. This woman, this Sabrina, had isolated Emily so completely that the child didn't know who to trust, didn't know what truth was anymore. What else did Sabrina say? Helen asked quietly. Emily looked down at the coloring page. She says I eat too much. She says I'm expensive. She says Daddy can't afford me. The words tumbled out now, faster, as if a dam had broken. She says I'm the reason Mommy died. She says if I wasn't born, Mommy would still be here. She says Daddy is tired of me. She says he wants me to go away, but he's too nice to say it. Helen's vision blurred with fury. She clenched her fists under the table, nails digging into her palms. This wasn't discipline. This wasn't even cruelty. This was psychological warfare waged against a child. Does Sabrina decide when you eat? Helen asked, her voice tight. Emily nodded. She makes the rules. She says if I break them, I don't get dinner. What are the rules? Emily recited them mechanically, as if she'd memorized them through repetition. Finish everything. Don't ask for more. Don't make noise. Don't bother Daddy. Don't talk about her. Helen wanted to scream, wanted to drive to Daniel's house right now and confront this monster. But she forced herself to stay calm, to keep Emily talking, to gather every piece of information she could. When you don't follow the rules, what happens? Emily's voice dropped to a whisper. I have to stay in my room. Sometimes all night. Sometimes she locks the door. She locks you in? Emily nodded. What about your dad? Where is he when this happens? He's there, but he doesn't say anything. Sabrina says he agrees with her. She says he wants me to learn. Helen closed her eyes briefly, fighting the wave of disgust. Daniel, her son-in-law, the man her daughter had loved, the man who was supposed to protect his child. He was allowing this, standing by while some woman tortured his daughter. Emily, Helen said, opening her eyes. I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell me if Sabrina ever hits you. Emily looked away. Sometimes. Where? My arms, my back, places where it doesn't show? Helen's hands trembled. Does your dad know? I don't know, he's usually working. Or upstairs. Translation. Daniel knew. He had to know. You couldn't live in a house with a terrified, starving child and not know something was wrong. Unless you chose not to see it. Unless you were too weak, too compromised, too selfish to face it. Helen stood up, her legs unsteady. She walked to the sink and gripped the edge of the counter, breathing slowly. Behind her, Emily was silent, probably terrified she'd said too much. Helen turned back around. Emily was crying quietly now, tears streaming down her face. Am I going to get in trouble? The child whispered. Helen crossed the room quickly and knelt down beside her, pulling her into a hug. Emily went stiff at first, then slowly, tentatively leaned into the embrace. Her small body shook with silent sobs. No, baby, you're not in trouble. You're so brave. So brave. Emily cried harder. Helen held her, rubbing her back, whispering reassurances, and as she did, her mind raced. Sabrina, a woman living in Daniel's home, controlling Emily's food, locking her in rooms, hitting her, manipulating her, poisoning her sense of reality, and Daniel was allowing it, maybe even participating. Helen needed more information. She needed to know who this woman was, how she'd entered Daniel's life, what her relationship to him really was, and, most importantly, she needed evidence, documentation, witnesses. She couldn't just storm in with accusations. That would give Sabrina time to cover her tracks, time to coach Emily, time to manipulate Daniel further. Helen pulled back and looked at Emily's tear-stained face. Sweetheart, I need you to stay here with me for a few more days. Can you do that? Emily nodded. And I need you to know something. What Sabrina said about your mommy, about your daddy not wanting you, None of that is true. Your daddy loves you, and your mommy loved you more than anything in the world. Do you understand? Emily's lip trembled. Then why does Sabrina say those things? Because she's cruel, and cruel people say cruel things to make themselves feel powerful. Emily wiped her eyes. Is she going to know I told you? No. This is between you and me. Emily nodded slowly, but fear still clouded her eyes. Helen helped her wash her face, then set up a movie in the living room. Emily curled up on the couch with the old stuffed rabbit from her backpack. Within minutes, she was asleep, exhausted from crying. Helen went to her bedroom and closed the door. She picked up her phone and stared at it for a long moment. Then she scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for. Maggie Thompson, her neighbor, her friend, and someone who lived directly across from Daniel's house. Helen pressed call. Maggie answered on the third ring. Helen, everything okay? Maggie, I need your help. Maggie Thompson arrived with a thermos of coffee and deep concern in her eyes. Helen led her to the kitchen while Emily slept in the living room. She explained why she'd called, keeping her voice low. She needed to know what Maggie had seen from across the street, needed confirmation that her instincts were right. Maggie set down her mug with trembling hands. She'd been worried about Emily for months, but hadn't known what to do. 6 months ago, a woman had appeared at Daniel's house. Tall, dark-haired, professionally dressed, but cold. At first, Maggie had thought it was healthy. Daniel dating again after years alone. But the woman hadn't been visiting. She'd moved in. Her car never left. Lights stayed on in the upstairs bedroom, Helen's daughter's old room, and her treatment of Emily was harsh, rough, controlling. Maggie described pulling Emily by the arm, yanking her through doors, speaking harshly across the driveway. Emily always moved carefully around her, like someone who'd learned that mistakes had consequences. But one incident haunted Maggie most. 2 months ago, late November, past 11 at night. Maggie's back pain had kept her awake. She'd gone for water and glanced out the kitchen window. Emily stood on Daniel's porch in thin pajamas. No coat, no shoes. The temperature had dropped into the 40s. The child was trying the doorknob repeatedly, pulling and twisting, but it stayed locked. She wasn't crying or calling out, just testing the knob mechanically, as if she'd learned persistence was her only option. Maggie had watched for 15 minutes, frozen between intervention and uncertainty. Should she call someone? What if she was wrong? What if interfering made things worse? Then the door opened. The dark-haired woman grabbed Emily's arm and dragged her inside. Rough, angry, no concern about the cold or the child's distress. Emily hadn't resisted. She'd gone limp, compliant, as if this was familiar. Expected. Part of a pattern she'd learned not to fight. Helen listened with her hands clenched. She slid her notebook across the table and asked Maggie to write everything down. Every detail, every date, every observation. Maggie wrote for 30 minutes. 3 full pages. The locked door incident with specific details. Date, time, temperature, duration. Other moments too. Emily being handled roughly. Mornings when the child looked thinner, paler, more withdrawn. Helen scanned the pages. This was real evidence. Documented, witnessed. She asked about the woman's appearance. Maggie described her carefully. 5'8" or 9, dark brown hair pulled back, thin, sharp features, mid-30s, younger than Daniel. Professional clothes even at home. She carried herself with authority, like she owned the space. Her name was Sabrina. Maggie had heard Daniel use it once. Helen added this to her notes. Emily hadn't invented this person. Sabrina was real, established, controlling Daniel's household. Maggie offered another observation. She never saw Daniel and Sabrina behave like a couple. No affection, no warmth. They functioned like business associates, as if Sabrina was managing him rather than partnering with him. Helen's instincts sharpened. Abusers often controlled entire households first, but this felt different, more calculated, as if Sabrina had a specific goal beyond simple domination. She thought about Emily's words. She says I'm expensive. She says Daddy can't afford me. Why would someone move into a home, terrorize a child, and stay? What was the payoff? Money seemed likely. Control over something valuable. But what? Helen asked if Maggie would make an official statement if needed. Would she testify despite potential backlash from Daniel or the neighborhood? Maggie agreed without hesitation. She should have acted sooner, she said quietly. Should have trusted her instincts months ago. After Maggie left, Helen reviewed everything in her notebook. The evidence was substantial. Physical bruises, behavioral indicators, witness testimony, a clear pattern with a specific perpetrator. She created a timeline. 6 months ago, Sabrina moved in. 2 months ago, the locked door incident. 3 weeks ago, based on fading bruises, a physical assault. 1 week ago, Emily wrote her list of rules. Yesterday, Daniel dropped Emily off with no explanation. Gaps remained. Helen didn't know who Sabrina really was, how she'd entered Daniel's life, why Daniel tolerated her treatment of Emily, what kept him complicit or paralyzed. Helen called Daniel again, voicemail again. She left a sharper message this time, mentioning both Emily and Sabrina by name. He needed to know she was aware. He didn't call back. Helen stared at her phone. She could confront Daniel directly, drive to his house, demand answers. But that would alert Sabrina. Give her time to prepare, time to manipulate Daniel, time to coach Emily if she regained access. Helen needed official intervention. Someone with authority. Someone who could act quickly and protect Emily legally. She opened her laptop and found the contact information. The county office for protective services. The same office she'd worked with years ago. She made the call. Identified herself. Stated her purpose. Then laid out every piece of evidence methodically. The bruises, the starvation, the locked doors, the psychological manipulation, Maggie's witness statement, Emily's handwritten rules. The woman named Sabrina who controlled the household. The intake worker's tone shifted from routine to focused. They would open an emergency investigation immediately. Could Helen bring Emily in tomorrow for an interview? Could she provide all documentation? Helen confirmed everything. When she hung up, her hands shook from adrenaline. The wheels were in motion. No reversing course now. In the living room, Emily stirred and sat up. She looked around before spotting Helen. Helen went to her and sat down. Emily leaned against her without speaking. Helen wrapped an arm around the child's shoulders. Emily's body remained tense, conditioned to expect that safety was temporary. That comfort preceded punishment. That trust was dangerous. But Helen wasn't backing down. Not this time. Not ever. Tomorrow, investigators would ask questions. Documentation would become part of a legal case, and Sabrina would face consequences. Helen looked down at Emily's face. The child's eyes were closed, but her breathing remained shallow, alert even in rest. Helen tightened her arm around her granddaughter. This ends now. The building looked exactly as Helen remembered it. Gray concrete, institutional windows, a parking lot filled with tired sedans. She'd been here countless times during her teaching years, accompanying social workers, providing testimony, fighting for children who had no one else. She hadn't expected to return, not at 72, not after retirement, not after promising herself she was done with this particular kind of heartbreak. But Emily sat beside her in the car now, small and silent, staring at the building with wide eyes. Helen turned off the engine and looked at her granddaughter. The child's hands were folded in her lap, shoulders hunched forward in that defensive posture Helen had come to recognize. Emily knew something important was happening, something that would change things. Children always knew, even when adults tried to hide it. Helen reached over and gently touched Emily's hand. The child flinched slightly, then relaxed. They walked into the building together. The lobby smelled of industrial cleaner and old coffee. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. A receptionist looked up from behind bulletproof glass and smiled with practiced warmth. Helen gave her name. They were expected. Within minutes, a woman appeared through a security door. Mid-40s, dark hair pulled into a practical bun, eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. She introduced herself as Jordan Hale, lead investigator for the county's Protective Services Division. She shook Helen's hand, then knelt down to Emily's level without crowding her. She didn't touch the child, didn't force eye contact, just offered a gentle smile and said they were going to talk for a little while, and Emily could take breaks whenever she needed. Emily nodded once, barely perceptible. Jordan led them down a hallway to a small interview room. It was designed to feel less institutional than the rest of the building. Soft lighting, comfortable chairs, a table with crayons and paper, a shelf of toys in the corner. But the camera mounted discreetly in the ceiling gave away its true purpose. Helen sat in a chair along the wall while Jordan settled across from Emily at the table. Another woman entered, a child psychologist, Jordan explained, who specialized in trauma interviews. She would observe and ensure Emily felt safe throughout the process. Jordan opened a folder and pulled out a simple form. She explained to Emily that they were going to talk about her home, her family, her daily life. She emphasized repeatedly that Emily wasn't in trouble, that telling the truth was important and safe, that no one would be angry with her for being honest. Emily listened without speaking. Her eyes darted occasionally to Helen, checking that she was still there. Jordan started with easy questions. What grade was Emily in? What was her favorite subject? Did she have friends at school? Emily answered in whispers, single words when possible. Yes, no, 2nd grade. Reading. Not really. Then Jordan shifted carefully to harder territory. Who lived in Emily's house? Emily's shoulders tensed. She named her father, paused. Then, so quietly Jordan had to lean forward, she whispered the second name. Sabrina. Jordan wrote it down without reaction. She asked how long Sabrina had lived there. Emily didn't know exactly. A long time. Since last year, maybe. The child's sense of time was vague, understandably. Trauma disrupted memory that way. Jordan asked what Sabrina did in the house. Emily's answers came slowly, each one requiring visible effort. Sabrina made dinner, decided rules, told Daddy what to do, told Emily when to go to her room. Jordan asked about meals. What did Emily usually eat? When did she eat? Who decided portions? The voice of Emily got even quieter. Sabrina decided. Sometimes Emily got to eat normal amounts, sometimes not. It depended on whether she'd been good. What did being good mean? Emily listed the rules from memory. Don't talk too much. Finish everything. Don't ask for more. Be quiet. Don't bother Daddy. Jordan nodded, writing continuously. She asked if Emily ever felt hungry at home. Emily nodded. Jordan asked if she ever got hurt at home. Emily froze. Her breathing quickened. She looked at Helen again, eyes desperate. Helen gave her an encouraging nod. Emily turned back to Jordan and nodded once. Jordan asked if Emily could show her where she got hurt. Emily slowly pushed up her sleeves. The bruises were fading now, but still visible. Jordan photographed them carefully, speaking gently throughout the process, thanking Emily for being brave. Then, Jordan asked the critical question. Who hurt her? Emily's eyes filled with tears. She pressed her lips together hard. Jordan waited patiently. No pressure, no rushing, just quiet presence. Finally, Emily whispered it. Sabrina. Jordan asked if Daddy knew. Emily shrugged. Sometimes he was home, sometimes he wasn't. Sometimes he was upstairs or in another room. Sabrina said he agreed with the rules. Sabrina said he wanted Emily to learn. The interview continued for another 20 minutes. Jordan asked about the locked doors, the nights outside, the hidden food. Emily confirmed everything, her voice growing tired but steady. The psychologist interjected occasionally with supportive comments, reminding Emily she was doing great, that she was safe here. When they finished, Jordan thanked Emily sincerely. She said Emily had been incredibly brave. She gave her a small, stuffed animal from the shelf, a soft bear with button eyes. Emily clutched it against her chest.
Jordan asked Helen to step into the hallway while the psychologist stayed with Emily. Once the door closed, Jordan's professional composure cracked slightly. She said she'd worked these cases for 15 years. This was clear-cut abuse. Systematic, prolonged. The physical evidence combined with Emily's consistent, detailed testimony left no doubt. She said they would move immediately to the next phase. A formal investigation would open within hours. A caseworker would be assigned. Daniel would be contacted and required to cooperate. Sabrina would be interviewed separately. Helen handed over her documentation. The notebook filled with observations, the photographs of bruises, Maggie's written statement, Emily's handwritten list of rules. Jordan reviewed everything quickly, her expression hardening with each page. She said this was excellent documentation. Thorough, professional, exactly what they needed to build a strong case. She asked Helen directly if she was willing to seek emergency custody. The state could place Emily in foster care temporarily, but keeping her with family was always preferable if that family member was safe and capable. Helen didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. Emily would stay with her for as long as necessary. Jordan nodded with visible relief. She said she'd begin the paperwork immediately. They'd need a home visit to verify Helen's living situation was appropriate. They'd need background checks. But, given Helen's history as an educator and her existing documentation, approval would likely come quickly. Helen asked what would happen next with Daniel and Sabrina. Jordan explained the process carefully. An investigator would visit the home unannounced within 24 hours. Both adults would be interviewed separately. The home would be inspected. If Sabrina had no legal relationship to Emily, no guardianship papers, no formal custody arrangement, she could be barred from contact with the child immediately. If Daniel cooperated, showed remorse, agreed to remove Sabrina from the home, he might retain supervised visitation rights. If he resisted or defended Sabrina, he could lose custody entirely. Helen asked about criminal charges. Jordan said that depended on the evidence and the prosecutor's assessment. Child abuse charges were possible. Neglect charges against Daniel were likely. But criminal cases moved slowly. The priority now was Emily's immediate safety. Helen thanked her. Jordan placed a hand on her shoulder briefly, a rare gesture of personal connection, and said she was glad Emily had someone like Helen fighting for her. They returned to the interview room. Emily was coloring quietly while the psychologist watched. She looked up when Helen entered, relief flooding her small face. They left the building together. Emily held Helen's hand in the parking lot, something she hadn't done voluntarily before. Her grip was tight, desperate. In the car, Emily spoke for the first time since the interview. She asked if she was going back to Daddy's house. Helen started the engine and looked at her granddaughter. She said no. Emily was staying with her, for as long as it took, maybe forever. Emily's eyes welled with tears, but this time they weren't tears of fear. They were something else, something that looked almost like hope. Helen drove them home. Her phone rang twice during the drive, Daniel's number both times. She didn't answer. Whatever he wanted to say, whatever excuses or explanations he'd prepared, could wait. Right now, Emily needed stability, safety, silence from the chaos. At home, Helen made lunch. Emily ate without asking permission first. Small progress, fragile progress, but progress nonetheless. The investigation had begun. Official channels were engaged, protection was being arranged, but Helen knew this was just the start. The real battle was coming, and she'd need every ounce of strength she had left to see it through. Jordan Hale called 3 days later with information that made Helen's blood run cold. The background check on Sabrina Holt had revealed something unexpected, something that changed the entire complexion of the case. Helen listened on the phone while Emily played quietly in the next room. Jordan's voice was tight, professional, but Helen could hear the underlying anger. Sabrina wasn't who Daniel claimed she was. She wasn't a woman he'd met recently through work or friends. She wasn't some new relationship that had developed naturally after his wife's death. Sabrina had worked in that house before. Years ago, when Emily was still a toddler,
She'd been Emily's nanny. Helen felt the room tilt. She sat down heavily at the kitchen table, gripping the phone. Jordan continued. The employment records showed Sabrina had been hired when Emily was 18 months old. She'd worked for the family for approximately 8 months before being terminated. The termination had been abrupt, and while no formal complaints had been filed, there were notes in her employment history indicating concerns about her approach to childcare. Helen's mind raced backward through time. She remembered that period vaguely. Her daughter had been alive then, overwhelmed with new motherhood and Daniel's demanding work schedule. They'd hired help. Helen had met the nanny once or twice during brief visits. A younger woman, quiet, efficient, unmemorable. But her daughter had fired the nanny suddenly. Helen recalled a phone call where her daughter had seemed upset, using words like unsettling and wrong, but never providing specific details. At the time, Helen had assumed it was normal parental anxiety. New mothers often worried excessively about caregivers. She hadn't pushed for information. Now she wished desperately that she had. Jordan explained that after termination, Sabrina had disappeared from their lives completely. No contact, no references requested, nothing. The family had moved on, hired someone else, and eventually her daughter had transitioned to staying home full-time with Emily. Then, 3 years ago, Helen's daughter had died. Daniel had been left alone with a 4-year-old, grieving, struggling, vulnerable. And somehow Sabrina had re-entered their lives. Jordan said the timing was significant. Sabrina had reappeared approximately 6 months after the funeral. She'd contacted Daniel directly. Her approach had been calculated, sympathetic. She'd expressed condolences, offered help, reminded him that she had experience with Emily already, that she understood the family's needs. Daniel, drowning in grief and single parenthood, had accepted. Helen felt sick. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't a chance reunion. Sabrina had waited, watched, timed her return for maximum vulnerability. Jordan's investigation had uncovered more. During the years between her termination and her return, Sabrina had worked sporadically, brief positions in childcare, none lasting more than a few months. References were vague or absent. Background checks revealed nothing criminal but suggested a pattern of instability. More disturbing were financial records. Sabrina had significant debt. Credit cards maxed out, medical bills in collections, student loans in default. She'd filed for bankruptcy 2 years earlier. Her employment gaps suggested difficulty maintaining stable income. Helen asked why Sabrina would return to a household that had fired her. What was the motivation? Jordan paused before answering. She said they were still investigating, but preliminary findings suggested Sabrina had done research. Extensive research. On the family. On Emily, specifically. Helen's stomach dropped. Research? What kind of research? Jordan explained carefully. Sabrina had accessed certain public records in the months before contacting Daniel. Records related to Emily's mother's estate, her will, her assets. Helen's daughter had been financially prudent. She'd had life insurance, savings, property, and she'd structured everything carefully in her will to protect Emily. The bulk of the estate had been placed in a trust fund specifically for Emily's benefit. It couldn't be touched by anyone except for Emily's direct needs: education, healthcare, housing. But there was a clause. If Daniel became incapacitated or otherwise unable to manage Emily's care, a secondary guardian would need to be appointed. That guardian would have legal authority to make decisions about Emily's trust fund. Helen felt understanding dawn like cold water. Sabrina hadn't returned out of kindness or lingering affection for the family. She'd returned because she'd identified a vulnerable target with substantial assets. Jordan confirmed Helen's suspicion. Sabrina's browsing history, obtained through warrant, showed searches related to trust fund management, guardianship law, and parental rights termination. She'd researched how guardians could be appointed, what circumstances would allow someone outside of the immediate family to gain legal control of a child. The pattern was clear. Sabrina had re-entered Daniel's life with a specific goal: She needed access to Emily. But more than that, she needed Daniel to become dependent on her, needed him compromised, needed him either complicit or incapacitated enough that she could position herself as Emily's necessary guardian. The abuse hadn't been random cruelty, it had been strategic. Sabrina had been systematically breaking Emily down, isolating her, making her difficult for Daniel to manage, making Daniel feel overwhelmed and inadequate as a parent, creating conditions where removing Emily from his care would seem not just justified, but necessary. And once Sabrina became Emily's legal guardian, she'd have control over the trust fund, control over Emily's inheritance, control over everything Helen's daughter had worked to protect. Helen asked how close Sabrina had come to succeeding. Jordan said, uncomfortably close. Sabrina had been building a case, documenting Daniel's parenting failures, many of which she'd orchestrated, collecting evidence of Emily's behavioral problems, which were actually trauma responses to Sabrina's abuse. She'd been preparing to petition for guardianship, claiming Daniel was unfit and that she, as the only stable adult in Emily's life, was the appropriate alternative. If Helen hadn't intervened when she did, if Emily hadn't been removed from that house, Sabrina might have succeeded within months. Helen sat in silence, processing the enormity of it. This woman had targeted a grieving family, had identified a vulnerable widower and his traumatized child, had calculated the exact value of a dead woman's estate, had crafted a years-long plan to steal a child's inheritance by first stealing the child. Jordan said the investigation was expanding. They were looking into whether Sabrina had done this before, whether other families had been targeted, whether there were other children who'd suffered under her calculated abuse. Helen asked what happened next. Jordan explained that with this information, the case had escalated. Child Protective Services was coordinating with law enforcement now. Criminal charges were being prepared, fraud, child abuse, exploitation, possibly more depending on what else they uncovered. Daniel was being re-interviewed tomorrow. He'd already been contacted once and had seemed genuinely shocked by the allegations. He'd claimed ignorance about Sabrina's past employment, claimed she'd told him they'd never met before, claimed he'd trusted her completely. Jordan's tone made clear what she thought of Daniel's claims. Ignorance wasn't innocence. He'd allowed his daughter to be abused under his roof. Whether through active participation or willful blindness, he was culpable. Helen asked if Daniel would face charges too. Jordan said likely yes, child endangerment at minimum. Possibly more if they could prove he'd known about the abuse and failed to stop it. His custody rights were already suspended pending the investigation's outcome. Whether he'd ever regain them was questionable. Helen felt no satisfaction in that. Daniel was weak, foolish, selfish perhaps, but he'd loved Helen's daughter once. He'd created Emily. Some part of Helen had hoped he was simply misguided, simply manipulated, simply too broken by grief to see clearly, but hoping didn't change facts. He'd failed Emily, catastrophically, unforgivably. Jordan said she'd keep Helen updated as the investigation progressed. She reminded Helen that the home visit for custody verification was scheduled for tomorrow afternoon. She asked if Helen had any questions. Helen had dozens, but the one that mattered most was simple. Was Emily safe now? Truly safe? Jordan answered honestly, as safe as they could make her within the system. Sabrina had been barred from contact. Daniel's access was supervised and limited. Emily was with Helen, who had proven herself capable and committed, but safety was never absolute. They'd remain vigilant. After hanging up, Helen sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Emily appeared in the doorway eventually, the stuffed bear from the interview clutched in her arms. She asked if everything was okay. Helen looked at her granddaughter, at this small child who'd been targeted by a predator, who'd been valued not for herself, but for the money she represented, who'd been abused systematically as part of a calculated theft. Helen stood and crossed the room. She knelt down and pulled Emily into a careful hug. She said yes. Everything was going to be okay now. It was half truth, half promise. The kind adults tell children when the full truth would be too heavy to bear. But Helen would make it true, whatever it took. However long the fight lasted. She'd promised her daughter years ago, standing by a hospital bed, that she'd protect Emily if anything happened. She'd failed to save her daughter from cancer. But she wouldn't fail this. Not now. Not ever. Helen's lawyer arrived with a manila folder that would change everything. Linda Park had practiced family law for 20 years. She specialized in custody disputes and child protection cases. Jordan Hale had recommended her personally, and Helen had hired her immediately after the background check revealed Sabrina's history. Now Linda sat across from Helen at the kitchen table with documents spread between them. Emily was at school, her first day back after a week away. Helen had worried about sending her, but the psychologist had insisted routine would help. Normalcy was healing. Linda opened the folder and pulled out financial records. Her expression was grim. The investigation had uncovered the full scope of Sabrina's plan. It was worse than anyone had initially suspected, more calculated, more devastating, more proof of long-term predatory intent. Helen's daughter had established a trust fund for Emily shortly before her death. The amount was substantial, nearly $400,000 from life insurance, property sales, and savings. The trust was structured carefully with specific provisions. Emily couldn't access it until 18 except for approved expenses like education and medical care. The trustee was designated as Daniel, with Helen listed as successor if Daniel became unable to serve. But there was a clause Linda read aloud carefully. If both designated trustees were unavailable or deemed unfit, the court could appoint an alternative guardian who would assume trustee responsibilities. That guardian would have legal authority to manage the funds for Emily's benefit. Sabrina had discovered this structure. The documents showed she'd obtained copies of the trust paperwork somehow, likely through public records or by accessing Daniel's files while living in his home. She'd studied every provision, every loophole, every possible avenue to control. Her plan had been methodical. First, establish herself in the household. Second, make herself indispensable to Daniel. Third, systematically undermine Daniel's ability to parent effectively. Fourth, create documented evidence of his failures. Fifth, petition for guardianship, claiming Emily needed intervention, and she was the only viable option. Linda had obtained records showing Sabrina had consulted with 3 different lawyers over the past year. She'd asked detailed questions about guardianship law, trust fund management, and parental rights termination. She'd researched precedents. She'd identified exactly what evidence she'd need to build a compelling case. The abuse hadn't been random. Every incident had served her larger strategy. Starving Emily made the child appear neglected under Daniel's care. The bruises suggested physical abuse happening on Daniel's watch. The psychological torture created behavioral problems that would make Emily seem difficult and Daniel seem overwhelmed. The isolation prevented outside intervention until Sabrina was ready to act. She'd been documenting everything. Helen learned this with cold fury. Sabrina had kept her own records. Photographs of Emily looking thin and unkempt. Videos of the child having emotional breakdowns, carefully edited to remove Sabrina's provocations. Written logs describing Daniel's absences, his drinking, his inability to manage his daughter, all framed to make him look neglectful and incompetent. Sabrina had planned to present this evidence to family court within 2 months. She'd already drafted the petition. Linda had obtained a copy through discovery. It painted Daniel as a failing parent drowning in grief and alcohol, unable to provide adequate care. It positioned Sabrina as the stable adult who'd stepped in to help, but now recognized the situation required legal intervention for Emily's welfare. The petition requested Sabrina be named Emily's legal guardian with full authority over her care and finances. It included character references Sabrina had cultivated, people who'd only seen her public persona and had no idea about the private abuse. It had a financial plan showing how she'd manage Emily's trust responsibly. It was convincing, professional, expertly crafted. If Helen hadn't intervened, if Emily hadn't revealed the truth, if Maggie hadn't witnessed the abuse, the petition might have succeeded. Linda explained the financial motive plainly. As guardian and trustee, Sabrina would control $400,000. The money was restricted to Emily's benefit legally, but trustees had significant discretion. Housing costs, educational expenses, medical needs, therapeutic services, all of these could be interpreted broadly. Sabrina could have installed herself in a large home claiming Emily needed space, enrolled her in expensive private schools taking administrative fees, arranged therapeutic programs run by associates who'd kick back portions of the payments. Even with restrictions, a determined trustee could siphon substantial amounts over years. By the time Emily turned 18, much of the inheritance could have vanished into Sabrina's accounts through carefully documented but fraudulent expenses. And there was more. Linda had discovered Sabrina had recently purchased a guardianship insurance policy, an unusual type of coverage that would pay her a settlement if Emily died while under her care. The policy was small, only $50,000, but combined with the trust fund access, it revealed the full depth of Sabrina's intentions. She hadn't just wanted Emily's money. She'd wanted Emily herself eliminated as a person, reduced to a financial asset to be exploited and eventually discarded. Helen sat in stunned silence. This was beyond abuse, beyond cruelty. This was attempted murder plotted in slow motion through systematic destruction of a child's body, mind, and legal protections. Linda continued. The prosecution was building criminal cases now, multiple charges: child abuse, fraud, exploitation of a vulnerable person, attempted theft, possibly conspiracy if they could prove Sabrina had accomplices. The evidence was overwhelming. Sabrina's own documentation had become proof of her guilt. Daniel was cooperating now, Linda said. He'd broken down during his second interview when confronted with the evidence. He'd admitted Sabrina had manipulated him, had isolated him from Helen and other family, had convinced him Emily's problems stemmed from grief over losing her mother rather than from Sabrina's abuse, had made him believe he was inadequate as a parent and needed her guidance. He claimed he hadn't known about the physical abuse, claimed he'd been working long hours and traveling frequently while Sabrina managed the household, claimed he'd trusted her completely because she'd presented herself as helpful and competent. Linda's tone made clear what she thought of these claims. Willful ignorance was still culpability. Daniel had chosen not to see, had chosen not to question, had chosen his own comfort over his daughter's welfare. Helen asked what would happen to Daniel. Linda said his parental rights were suspended indefinitely. Whether they'd be terminated permanently depended on the criminal proceedings and his level of cooperation. At minimum, he'd face charges for child endangerment. At worst, accomplice charges, if evidence showed he'd known more than he claimed. Helen felt no sympathy. Her daughter had trusted Daniel to protect Emily. He'd failed catastrophically. Whatever consequences he faced were deserved. Linda gathered the documents back into the folder. She said the custody hearing was scheduled for next month. Given the evidence, Helen's guardianship would almost certainly be approved. Sabrina was facing years in prison. Daniel's rights would likely be terminated. Emily would be safe with Helen permanently. After Linda left, Helen sat alone with the weight of what she'd learned. Sabrina hadn't just been cruel. She'd been calculating, patient, methodical. She'd spent years planning the exploitation of a child for money. Helen thought about Emily at school right now, trying to relearn what normal felt like, trying to believe food wouldn't be taken away, trying to trust adults again. The damage Sabrina had inflicted would take years to heal, maybe a lifetime, but Emily was alive, safe, away from the predator who'd targeted her, and that predator would face justice. Helen stood and walked to the window. Outside, autumn leaves drifted across the lawn. The world continued its ordinary rhythms, indifferent to the evil that had been uncovered and stopped. But Helen wasn't indifferent. She'd fight until Sabrina was convicted. Fight until Emily felt safe. Fight until her granddaughter understood she was valued for herself, not for money. Fight until the damage was healed, however long it took. The courtroom smelled of old wood and anxiety. Helen sat behind the plaintiff's table with Linda Park beside her. Across the aisle, Sabrina wore a navy suit and neutral expression. She looked nothing like the monster from the reports. That was intentional. She was performing innocence. Daniel sat separately, hollow-eyed and 20 pounds thinner. Helen felt nothing looking at him. Judge Patricia Morrison entered. Everyone rose. The proceedings began. Rachel Chen, the prosecutor, presented evidence methodically. Photographs of Emily's bruises filled the screen. Medical reports documented malnutrition and trauma. The psychologist's evaluation described systematic abuse. Maggie Thompson testified first. She described watching Emily locked outside in the cold, the rough handling, the visible fear. Judge Morrison took notes throughout. Jordan Hale presented the investigation findings. Sabrina's prior employment as Emily's nanny, her calculated return after the mother's death, financial records showing research into trust funds and guardianship law. Rachel displayed Sabrina's own documents. The guardianship petition she'd drafted, her logs documenting Daniel's failures while hiding her role in creating them, the insurance policy naming Emily as beneficiary. Each piece built the prosecution's case higher. This wasn't impulsive cruelty. This was premeditated exploitation spanning years. Then Rachel played Emily's video interview. The small voice filled the courtroom describing rules, hunger, locked doors, violence, manipulation. Helen watched Sabrina's face. No emotion, no remorse, just cold calculation. When the video ended, Rachel rested her case. Sabrina's attorney stood for defense. His strategy was clear immediately. Paint Sabrina as overwhelmed by a difficult child and incompetent father. He called character witnesses, a neighbor who thought Sabrina seemed responsible. A former employer describing her as professional. People who knew nothing about what happened privately. He argued Emily's testimony was unreliable. Children misinterpreted discipline. Children exaggerated. The bruises could be accidents. He suggested Daniel was the real problem, a neglectful alcoholic who needed a scapegoat. Sabrina had tried to help, he claimed, had provided structure where Daniel failed. Her guardianship petition reflected genuine concern, not theft. It was skilled defense work, plausible if you ignored evidence. Judge Morrison remained neutral. Then Sabrina testified. She admitted living there, admitted helping with Emily, denied all abuse. The child was troubled, she claimed, acting out from grief. Sabrina had used standard discipline, timeouts, restricted privileges, nothing abusive. The bruises? Emily was clumsy, accident-prone. The starvation? Emily was a picky eater refusing meals. The locked doors? A misunderstanding. The door stuck, sometimes. Each lie delivered smoothly, confidently. If Helen hadn't known truth, she might have believed it. Rachel cross-examined aggressively. Why hide previous employment from Daniel? Sabrina claimed she barely remembered. It seemed irrelevant. How did she obtain trust fund documents? Found them organizing paperwork. Why research guardianship law? Simple concern for Emily's welfare, the insurance policy? Many caregivers carried such protection. Consultations with multiple lawyers? Wanted to understand options before approaching Daniel? Every answer was rehearsed, prepared. Sabrina had anticipated everything, but Rachel produced evidence Sabrina couldn't explain. Bank records showing $80,000 in debt. Credit cards maxed. Bankruptcy declared 2 years prior. Why would someone financially desperate volunteer unpaid childcare unless expecting payoff? Sabrina faltered, recovered, claimed she cared. Money wasn't relevant. Rachel showed search history. Queries about trust fund access, how guardians use funds, what happens to assets if minors die. Why search that if innocent? Sabrina stammered, claimed curiosity, claimed she wanted to understand Emily's situation to help Daniel plan. Judge Morrison's expression shifted. Skepticism replaced neutrality. Rachel played Emily's video again, asked Sabrina to explain detailed, consistent descriptions if nothing happened. Sabrina claimed Emily was confused, possibly coached by Helen. Children could be manipulated. The accusation hung obviously ridiculous. Rachel rested. Daniel testified next. Admitted absence. Admitted blind trust in Sabrina. Admitted he should have paid attention. His attorney portrayed him as victim, too. Manipulated. Deceived. But Rachel destroyed that efficiently. Showed dates Daniel was home during documented abuse. Times he saw visible bruises. Moments he enforced Sabrina's cruel rules. Daniel broke down. Admitted weakness. Admitted failure. Wept on stand. Helen felt nothing watching him cry. After 2 days, closing arguments began. Rachel summarized overwhelming evidence: physical abuse, psychological torture, financial exploitation, premeditation. Everything pointed to Sabrina as calculating predator targeting vulnerable child for money. She requested maximum sentencing, permanent custody removal, restitution, justice. Sabrina's attorney gave passionate defense. Reasonable doubt, misunderstanding, circumstantial evidence. He requested acquittal or reduced charges. Judge Morrison called brief recess. When she returned, her face was set. She delivered verdict without preamble. Child abuse, guilty. Fraud, guilty. Exploitation, guilty. Each guilty landed like hammer. Sabrina's composure cracked. Her face went pale. Judge Morrison called the crimes calculated, cruel, unconscionable. She described Sabrina as someone who weaponized a child's grief for personal gain. Evidence left no doubt about guilt or intent. Sentencing in 30 days. Maximum penalties likely given severity and premeditation. For Daniel, parental rights suspended immediately. Supervised visitation only, pending separate criminal proceedings for child endangerment. Helen granted full legal guardianship effective immediately. Deputies approached Sabrina. She finally showed emotion. Rage. Screamed this was wrong, that Helen poisoned everyone, that she'd done nothing wrong. Deputies led her away still screaming. Courtroom doors closed, muffling her voice. Daniel sat motionless, staring at nothing. Helen stood slowly. Linda congratulated her quietly. Justice served. Helen felt no triumph, just exhausted relief. Emily was safe, protected. The predator caged. That was enough. The courtroom was silent as Judge Morrison prepared to deliver her verdict. Helen sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Linda Park sat beside her, posture rigid with anticipation. Across the aisle, Sabrina stared straight ahead, her face carefully blank. Daniel slumped in his chair, looking smaller than Helen had ever seen him. Judge Morrison adjusted her reading glasses and looked down at the documents before her. When she spoke, her voice was firm and clear. Sabrina Holt was found guilty on all charges: child abuse in the first degree, fraud, attempted exploitation of a minor, criminal conspiracy. Each guilty verdict landed like a physical blow. Sabrina's carefully maintained composure cracked. Her face went pale. Her hands gripped the table edge. Judge Morrison did not pause. She described the crimes as among the most calculated and cruel she had encountered in 20 years on the bench. Sabrina had not acted impulsively or out of misguided discipline. She had targeted a grieving family, had identified a vulnerable child with substantial assets, had crafted a multi-year plan to steal that child's inheritance by first stealing the child herself. The judge's voice hardened as she detailed the evidence. The prior employment Sabrina had concealed, the financial records showing her desperation and her research, the systematic abuse designed not just to harm, but to create specific conditions that would support her guardianship petition. The insurance policy that revealed her ultimate intentions. This was not discipline gone wrong. This was predation, pure and calculated. Sentencing would occur in 30 days, but Judge Morrison made her intentions clear. She was considering maximum penalties on all counts. The charges carried combined sentences of up to 25 years. Given the severity, premeditation, and utter lack of remorse, she indicated she would likely impose consecutive rather than concurrent sentences. Sabrina would spend decades in prison. The judge then turned to Daniel Carter. His parental rights were suspended immediately and indefinitely. He would face separate criminal proceedings for child endangerment and failure to protect. His supervised visitation with Emily would continue only if the child's therapist deemed it appropriate and Emily herself expressed willingness. Otherwise, his access would be terminated completely. Judge Morrison's tone was withering as she addressed him directly. She said fathers had one fundamental duty: protect their children. Daniel had failed catastrophically, whether through active participation, willful blindness, or cowardice. He had allowed his daughter to suffer prolonged abuse in his own home. His claims of manipulation and ignorance did not absolve him. They condemned him further as someone too weak or too selfish to deserve parenthood. Daniel's lawyer tried to interject. Judge Morrison silenced him with a look. Finally, the judge granted Helen Marston full legal and permanent guardianship of Emily Carter. She commended Helen for her vigilance, her courage in pursuing justice despite family complications, and her obvious commitment to Emily's welfare. The child would remain in Helen's custody effective immediately with no restrictions and full parental authority. Judge Morrison set the gavel down and looked directly at Helen. She said Emily was fortunate to have someone willing to fight for her. Too many children in similar situations had no advocate, no one who noticed, no one who cared enough to act. Helen nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. The bailiff called for order as the judge prepared to adjourn. But before she could, Sabrina erupted. She stood abruptly, knocking her chair backward. Her carefully controlled facade shattered completely. She screamed that this was wrong, that the verdict was unjust, that Helen had manipulated everyone, that Emily was lying, that she had done nothing wrong, that she had only tried to help a troubled child and a failing father. Her attorney tried to restrain her. She shoved him away. Her voice rose higher, shrill with rage and desperation. She accused Helen of poisoning the investigation, accused Emily of being coached, accused Daniel of being weak and pathetic, accused the judge of bias. 2 deputies moved toward her. Sabrina continued screaming. She said they would all regret this, that the truth would come out eventually, that she would appeal and win, that Emily would suffer without her guidance. The deputies took her arms. She fought them, still screaming. They pulled her toward the side door that led to holding cells. Her voice echoed through the courtroom even as they dragged her through the doorway. Then the door closed, and suddenly there was silence. Judge Morrison's expression had not changed throughout the outburst. She simply stated for the record that the defendant's behavior further demonstrated her lack of remorse and instability. Then she adjourned court. People began standing, gathering papers, speaking in low voices. Helen remained seated, letting the reality settle over her. It was done. Truly done. Sabrina would go to prison. Emily was safe, protected by law now, not just by Helen's vigilance. Linda touched her arm gently. She said they should leave before media arrived. High-profile child abuse cases attracted attention, and Helen's priority should be getting home to Emily before news spread. Helen nodded and stood. Her legs felt unsteady. The adrenaline that had sustained her through weeks of investigation and preparation was draining away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. As they walked toward the exit, Helen glanced back once. Daniel still sat at his table, motionless. His lawyer was speaking to him, but he did not appear to be listening. He stared at nothing, his face blank with shock or grief or belated understanding. Helen felt no satisfaction seeing him broken, no vindication, just emptiness where anger had been. He had lost his daughter through his own failures. That was consequence enough. The legal system would handle the rest. Outside, autumn's sun was bright and cold. Helen blinked against the light. Linda walked her to her car, reviewing next steps. Paperwork to finalize guardianship, therapy arrangements for Emily, potential restitution if any of the trust fund had been touched. Testimony at Daniel's separate trial if needed. Helen listened, nodding at appropriate moments, but her mind was already moving ahead. Emily would be home from school soon. Helen had promised to be there when she arrived, had promised they would make cookies together. Normal things. safe things, the kind of ordinary moments Sabrina had stolen and Helen was determined to restore. She drove home carefully, her hands tight on the wheel. The streets were familiar, the same route she had driven for 40 years. But everything felt different now, heavier, more fragile. She had won today. Justice had been served, but the fight was not really over. Emily's healing would take years. The nightmares would not disappear overnight. Trust would rebuild slowly. Some damage might never fully repair. But Emily was safe. That was what mattered. Safe and loved and protected by someone who would never, ever fail her again. Helen pulled into her driveway just as the school bus rounded the corner. Perfect timing. She got out and waited by the mailbox. The bus stopped. The doors opened. Emily climbed down carefully, her backpack almost as large as she was. When she saw Helen, her face brightened. Not a full smile yet. Emily was still learning that smiles were allowed, but something lighter. Something that looked almost like hope. Helen opened her arms. Emily ran to her and buried her face against Helen's chest. Helen held her tightly, feeling the small body relax slightly in the embrace. They stood that way for a long moment. Then Emily pulled back and looked up. She asked if everything was okay. Helen knelt down so they were eye level. She said yes, everything was okay now. The bad people could not hurt her anymore. She was safe. She was home. She was loved. Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. Helen stood and took her hand. They walked inside together. Justice was not triumphant. It was quiet, heavy, necessary, but it was real. And for Emily, it was enough. Emily moved into Helen's home permanently 3 weeks after the trial ended. The transition was not dramatic. Most of her belongings were already there. The bedroom that had been temporary was now officially hers. Helen helped her arrange things the way she wanted. A small desk by the window for homework, shelves for books, a lamp with a soft pink shade that Emily had chosen herself at the store. It was the choosing that mattered. For the first time in years, Emily was making decisions about her own space, her own life. Small decisions, but meaningful ones. The nightmares came frequently at first. Helen would wake to soft crying from down the hall and find Emily sitting up in bed, trembling and disoriented. She never remembered what she had dreamed, only that it had been bad, scary, that someone had been angry. Helen would sit with her until the fear passed, would remind her where she was, would promise that no one here would hurt her, that doors stayed unlocked, that food was always available, that love did not come with conditions or punishments. Gradually, the nightmares became less frequent. Once a week, then once every 2 weeks. Progress was not linear. Some nights were harder than others, but the trajectory moved slowly toward healing. Food remained complicated. Emily still asked permission sometimes before taking snacks. Still apologized if she did not finish everything on her plate. Still hid crackers occasionally, old habits dying hard despite reassurance. Helen never scolded her for these things. She simply reminded Emily gently that she could eat when hungry, that leaving food was acceptable, that no one would punish her for having needs. The school counselor worked with Emily twice a week. She helped the child process what had happened, helped her understand that the abuse was not her fault, that she had done nothing to deserve it, that Sabrina's cruelty reflected Sabrina's sickness, not Emily's worth. It was slow work, painful work, but necessary. Emily began speaking more as weeks passed. Not constantly. She was naturally quiet. But the silence was different now, less fearful, more thoughtful. She asked questions about Helen's day, commented on things she noticed, shared small observations about school or books or the weather. Each sentence was a tiny victory. One afternoon in early December, Helen was preparing dinner when Emily appeared in the kitchen doorway. She held a drawing she had made at school. It showed 2 figures, one tall, one small, both smiling. A house with a red door, a tree with colorful leaves, a sun in the corner, bright yellow with rays extending outward. Emily handed it to Helen shyly. She said it was them, their home. Helen felt tears prick her eyes. She studied the drawing carefully. The figures were holding hands. The house looked welcoming. The sun was prominent, taking up significant space in the sky. She told Emily it was beautiful, asked if she could hang it on the refrigerator. Emily nodded, pleased. Helen attached it with a magnet and stepped back. The drawing transformed the kitchen somehow, made it feel more complete, more like a real home rather than just a place where two people happened to live. Christmas approached. Helen asked Emily what she wanted. Emily thought for a long time before answering. She said maybe some new books and crayons. And if it was not too much to ask, maybe they could get a small Christmas tree. Helen's heart broke a little at the tentative request, the fear that wanting something was asking too much. She assured Emily they would absolutely get a tree. A big one, if Emily wanted. With lights and ornaments and everything. Emily's face lit up with cautious excitement. They went to the tree lot together on a cold Saturday morning. Emily walked among the rows of evergreens, touching branches gently, considering options seriously. She finally chose a 6-foot Douglas fir that was full and symmetrical. At home, they decorated it together. Helen had boxes of ornaments from decades past, her daughter's childhood decorations, handmade pieces from students over the years. Each one carried memories. She shared stories as they hung them. Emily listened intently, asking questions, wanting to know about the grandmother she barely remembered. Helen talked about her daughter honestly, the joy she had brought, the love she had given, the hole her death had left, but also the gift she had left behind. Emily herself, the most precious legacy. Emily was quiet after that, processing. Then she said she wished she remembered her mother better. Helen said that was okay, that memories faded sometimes, but love did not, that her mother had loved her completely and would be proud of how brave she had become. Emily nodded and carefully hung another ornament. When the tree was finished, they sat on the couch together looking at it. The lights glowed softly in the darkening room. Emily leaned against Helen's side, comfortable and relaxed, in a way she had not been months ago. She said it was the prettiest tree she had ever seen. Helen agreed. That night, Emily asked if she could call Helen something other than Grandma, something that felt right for their relationship now that they lived together permanently. Helen said she could call her whatever felt comfortable. Emily thought about it, then tentatively tried out a few options. Grandma Helen, Nana, just Helen. Nothing felt quite right. Finally, she asked if Grammy would be okay. It sounded warm, felt less formal than Grandma, but still connected to family. Helen smiled and said Grammy was perfect. From that night forward, Emily called her Grammy, and each time she said it, Helen felt something settle deeper, a sense of rightness, of permanence, of family rebuilt from broken pieces.